Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and today my guest is Gerald Steinberg, who's the founder and head of NGO Monitor. Welcome, Gerald.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Um, NGO Monitor, for those that don't realize it or don't know about it, is a really fantastic organization that goes and looks and researches every non-governmental organization out there, and anyone you could think of, from the big ones like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, down to these very little known but still sometimes effective groups that are specifically created for just really to bash Israel. These specific Palestinian groups that have no other reason except for just bashing Israel. I have a list over here of the NGO Monitor has a wonderful database showing A to Z list of all these groups. How many groups do you monitor?
Around 200, I'm told by the researcher it's creeping up beyond 200.
Oh yeah.
So maybe 220 by now.
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, but it's extremely impressive. I know for my blog, I use it extensively for research when I hear about a group and I want to look it up, and then you guys tell me everything I need to know about it. It tells the funders, who's behind it, what else they've done, what sort of anti-Israel activities they've done. Really, I mean, Yeshkayach, it's a great job.
Thank you.
What have you been working on lately? Anything cool?
I'm not sure how cool it is. And of course, in the era of COVID, it's very hard to get people's attention if it's not virus linked. But there are a couple of things actually that we did get attention on. It's not surprising whenever there's something new in the world. This it's the NGO network. They're basically focused on Israel bashing in all sorts of different ways, and there's a lot of money going into it. So it's not surprising that a number of them picked up on the theme of, well, there are two aspects. So one is Israel is responsible. This was maybe 2 months ago. There's going to be a massive wave of coronavirus infections and people in hospital and deaths in Gaza and the West Bank. And it's Israel's fault because Israel's the occupying power, Israel's evil, all that stuff. And a lot of the NGOs that we tend to monitor that are involved in these kinds of incitement campaigns against Israel, they picked up on that. So most of them were Palestinian. A couple of them were the more far left Israeli groups that blamed Israel as that even before anything happened. And then there's another group that used anti-Semitic themes. Israel's locking up the Palestinians in cages, and now this was around Passover time. Israelis went into a major lockdown quarantine, and they said, now you see how Palestinians have been suffering for 53 years or for 72 years, whatever the numbers they want to use are. Go back to 48, some of them, some to 67. And so these same NGOs, groups that claim to promote human rights, Gisha, which is an Israeli group that's entire objective, and they're funded by many European governments, is to put pressure on Israel to allow Palestinians in Gaza to be able to leave Gaza, and to eliminate, of course, the Israeli blockade to prevent terror. Weapons to be able to be smuggled into Gaza, completely ignoring Hamas. But they picked up on this theme, as did a lot of Palestinian groups. So I would say that's cool new information, but we blew the whistle on them, and that's what NGO Monitor does. We look for trends, we look at both broader activities and all the specifics, and we publish the information. One of the things that we emphasize. I'll get to the issue of NGO funding for terrorism or NGO involvement in terrorism, but we like to say, and it's more than just a cliche, that NGO Monitor knows more about who the European governments and other funders are funding than the organizations themselves. If you can open up my screen sharing, I'll give you a couple of illustrations of that because I think it's important
Uh,
as part of the
I think
discussion goes.
I don't know how to do that. Sorry, we should have
Okay.
done this ahead of time.
You're the host, so you have to. All right, it says
I
host disabled
I can
participant
share
screen. We'll let it go. Ah,
that.
maybe you get. If you get, otherwise, I'll just go to our website. But it's true that we tend to know NGO. We do research.
Yeah.
I'm an academic, and I've been for the last 40 years, 45 years,
Okay.
so
So
something
where
whatever.
do you want me to go on your website?
I do research, and we now have about 20 people doing research. About half of the people at NGO Monitor focus on European government-funded NGOs. A lot of those 200 plus groups get money from the Europeans. And to make it blunt, they have no idea who they're funding. Or if they do, then they go through a whole big song and dance, a real pretense of claiming we didn't know that our money was going to terrorists, and they're not really terrorists, and they used to be terrorists maybe, but they're not terrorists anymore. And that has caught on quite widely now in Europe, that whole theme. If you give me a couple of minutes, if you get bored, tell me, wave a hand or something. But I'll story because I think it's
No, but
interesting.
it's certainly. I mean, we can get to. I mean, there's so much stuff to unpack. Even from what you said already, Emily. Like Gisha has been one of the things that I've been following as well for years. I think I once managed to shame them into actually talking a little bit about Hamas's restrictions on movement because I said, look at their reports. They're like, they say they care about movement in and out, but when Hamas stops people from going in and out, they don't say anything. So then, like a week later, they actually put a tiny thing about that. It's and they also used to have these great statistics showing, how many Israelis or how many people from Gaza were able to get out. And then when Israel started allowing a lot more of them on there, and then the graphs started looking so much better, they took down the graphs because. So,
They're a campaign organization. It's a handful of people, which they get a lot of money. I've forgotten right now, but they get a lot of money from European governments.
mhm.
I think, and they're sort of an arm of European foreign policy, which is a lot of what these groups are. And rather than, not only do we want to name and shame and force these groups to be honest about what's going on, but we're trying to get the people who provide the government officials
Mhm.
to provide the money to take at least some responsibility, some ownership, some understanding of who they're funding and why they're funding them. And
Mhm.
that's about half of our work these days is to deal with those funders. Because if you're going to, it's because most of these people who do the NGO campaigning are absolutely committed to their agendas. And to be honest, I don't think you're going to change many people's minds. You get a little bit of tokenism. They'll insert a paragraph. It's like Human Rights Watch once every 5 years will write a report about Hamas firing rockets at Israel, and then they'll forget it instantly.
Sure. Well,
And they
even
go
in
back.
the reports, they'll say, they'll have an extra thing at the very end saying, "Of course, Gaza is under occupation and terrible circumstances." They'll always have to throw in that other paragraph. They won't ever do that on the anti-Israel report.
So if NGO Monitor is going to have an impact, as we do, a large part of that is to deal with and to put pressure on the people who are funding the organizations, the governments that are doing the funding, and also to some degree the main consumers, the the people who take the NGO reports as if they were the absolute truth and simply adopt them. We call it the halo effect. So that would be journalists, many journalists. Human Rights Watch wrote a report saying Israel does terrible things. That's a headline story because it's Human Rights Watch, and we don't have to independently check anything. Amnesty International says Israel's violating international law. Now, journalists don't say we don't really understand international law, but they just say Amnesty says or Human Rights Watch says. So I'd say about half of our work is dealing with the ability of these organizations to promote those agendas, meaning their funding, their access, what they do with their funding. And the other half is the substance of what they report to push back and say, well, this organization says Israel does all these terrible things. What's their evidence? Can we verify it? What do they say when they look at other countries in similar situations? Israel, and then it almost inevitably comes out that Israel is being treated with double standards or singling out. And then that becomes a question of is that why is Israel being singled out? What's your agenda here? Sometimes it's anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's the governments that want to force a change on Israeli policy. Well, that's a great way to do it. Let's give these far left organizations that are working inside of Israel to oppose the policies of the government. Let's give them lots of money, and then they'll be more powerful and they'll change policies. To which our response is, well, we like our democracy as a democracy. So you can give somebody else the money, but shouldn't be involved in manipulating Israeli public opinion. And I'd say in terms of influencing European funders, that's where we've had some significant success, and it's increasing.
Can you have some
That,
examples of some success stories in Europe?
well, I'll give you the big number, and then I'll go through some of the details. We estimate that in the last 10 years or so, we've cut off about over $50 million worth of money going to organizations that campaign against Israel, non-governmental organizations, groups that say they do human rights or that they do international aid. And that's 53 million. I think that's the latest number we have from through to 2018, maybe part of 2019. That's a significant amount of money that they're not getting. It's one of, and some of that comes from showing members of parliament that the money that they fund, that they provide, that their government provides, is not going to the purposes that the government claims it's going. And that was the case. There were four governments that said, okay, we're not going to decide who the money goes to. We're going to set up an office in Ramallah. We're going to give them on the order of $25 million to set up in Ramallah. And then they called it the Human Rights and International Law Secretariat. And we're going to let the people in Ramallah at Birzeit University decide which organizations are promoting international law and human rights. And we went to the Swiss, the Swedish, the Dutch government, and the Danish government. This was important. Let's save money, right? You let somebody else decide because we don't have the capability to make these decisions. And we overlap. Well, that organization gave a significant amount of money. Almost all of this money went to NGOs that are promoting BDS. Those are the good ones that promote lawfare. Israel commits war crimes and has to go to the International Criminal Court. A lot of those campaigns are basically led by NGO pressure. But also we found, and this is the beginning of a significant piece of work that we're still doing, that a number of those organizations, at least 5 out of the 25 that were getting money, were affiliated, had individuals that had direct connections, that were members of terrorist organizations, the PFLP in particular, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. Mm-hmm. I went to Bern in Switzerland with my colleague, and the two of us made a presentation and said to the Swiss members of parliament, this is where your money's going. There were members of every party in the room, which was a good thing, that they actually managed to get all the members of the parliament, all the representative groups in parliament sitting in one room for an hour to listen to this. Mm-hmm. And then some of them said, that's impossible. You must be lying. And some of them said, let us look at the data. About a year later, they passed a resolution which says that none of our money can go for these purposes. Right. And what happened was that this whole mechanism, the Swiss began, then the Dutch and the Danish followed, then the Swedish were left on their own. They're the last ones to get the message, but then they had no choice. So that organization, as of 2018, I believe, ceased to exist. And that was a big chunk of money that no longer went to these groups. Now, I'm not saying that no more money went from those 4 countries to the same NGOs, because there are other mechanisms, but it's way down to the degree that money still flows. We find out about it pretty quickly. Members of parliament, journalists write about it, and usually some common sense. And after a short period of time, they'll freeze the money, they'll look into it, and that's the end of it. So I don't want to make it sound like, hey, we're winning the war. There's still lots of money out there. I'd say maybe we've knocked off about 20% of the European government funding, but I think that's still significant. And a lot more should be coming off as governments realize how badly managed this whole NGO budget is, particularly when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian issues.
How much of the funding for these NGOs comes from actual European governments, and how much comes from, like foundations and things like that?
The governments account for, in round numbers, probably above 50%, and it varies from year to year, 50, 60%. Okay. They're funding a lot of organizations. Just to give you, all Western European governments, from Finland down through Italy and Spain, have budgets for human rights and international aid, economic aid, international development, of which a large part of those budgets go to NGOs. There are all these patron-client relations. They've been doing it for years. They all know each other. They go out for drinks with each other. It's really a closed circuit. Mm-hmm. Ministers get a budget of, let's say, let's take the case of the European Union or Britain or countries like that, where they have a substantial budget. Let's say they get a budget of 120, 130 million euros, pounds, krona, dollars every year for this purpose, for the purpose of funding what they call human rights or development aid and other good deeds. In the European Union, it was called the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Sometimes it goes to church organizations, so you may get a large part of that budget being given to Norwegian Church Aid or Dan Church Aid or one of those other organizations like that. And their job of these other, either the governments or the church organizations that get the money, or in the case of Holland, it's called Oxfam Novib that gets a large chunk of money.
Right.
And it's their job to use, they basically become subcontractors for the government. So that leads to, I said 60 and maybe even more in some cases percent of the money going to NGOs coming from these frameworks. And there's almost no supervision. We very often are in a situation, the ministers, the politicians who are signing off on this, they don't say, oh, we got a one-page summary and we signed off. But that's really the way it goes. In most countries, there are no parliamentary hearings. The United States is unique, and we did help that the British now have hearings on these things. Occasionally, other government.
Yeah, I mean, the output of these NGOs, again, I'm not talking specifically the big ones, the Amnesty and the Oxfam and HRW, but the ones that are specifically in the territories. It looks like, I mean, their entire existence is to generate reports, anti-Israel reports. They won't get money if they don't generate these anti-Israel reports. So that's a factory for that, and so that's one problem altogether, because it's the entire system is set up, is
right.
rigged against Israel to begin with, because nobody's really interested in pro-Israel reports. Nobody's going to pay for that.
No, the Europeans will say honestly, they'll say that they're somewhat honest about, we are opposed to Israeli occupation.
Mm-hmm.
Now they'll say we're opposed to occupation and annexation. These organizations are also opposed to occupation and annexation. We're working together to monitor, to whatever, report on. So yeah, it's built in. Mm-hmm. Almost no other country in the world gets treated like this. There's almost no other situation where there's nothing really comparable. There's some you can argue that in a few countries there's a little bit of this, that the Europeans are funding civil society, NGOs, to promote policies against the democratically elected government. There's a little bit of that in India. But let me answer your previous question about, I said 70%, 60, I said I'm upping a bit to 70 with what we call the indirect funding through churches, which are government funded. Mm-hmm. But then the other 30 to 40% is foundations. And there you have, that Amnesty gets most of its money. Human Rights Watch in the US gets almost all its money privately. And then you get lots of other groups like that, but those are the two big ones, that certainly in terms of campaigning against Israel. And there you have George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. It used to be the Ford Foundation, and wisely they realized their money was both wasted and being counterproductive. They backed off. And there you have the Rockefeller brothers, which are funding the Jewish Voice for Peace, which we always have to add in parentheses, neither much Jewish nor much peace. And if not now, and now there's something called Bend the Arc, which also is largely funded by non-Jewish sources to promote Jewish social action or Jewish moral commitments. And that's not a small amount of money either. Human Rights Watch has a budget of about $92 million a year. And since their funders are basically hidden, we get bits and pieces. I don't know whether Soros funds half of it or a third of it, but that's also a big chunk of money that goes into anti-Israel campaigning through that private money. So we try to monitor both. I'll just add that it's much harder to influence the private foundations. Soros said he doesn't really control where his money goes. He doesn't know very much about where his money goes, but he's got people who run the foundation, and they know where it goes, and they're not interested in hearing in any kind of reports about how their money's being abused. They're happy with it.
Yeah, and that's what it sounds like. It's and so can you just go through a couple of specific examples? Because I know, for example, like Defense for Children International, Palestine is completely dedicated. I mean, and I've looked at their reports, and they're just it's fiction. I mean, it's like they just make stuff up. Can you just go through some of the more egregious ones that are out there?
That's a good one that you started with. Defense for Children International Palestine, it's called. There is a big international group called Defense for Children International, and the DCIP, the Palestine part, is loosely affiliated, and we really don't know what the nature of that affiliation is, but it's not that important. They get money. They get money from a number of European governments. A number of their officers and board members are connected directly. They are at the same time, the same people are also commanders. They are part of the PFLP terrorist organization. Put that aside for a minute, right? That should already tell you where we're going here. It's a Palestinian organization, and their one single goal is to use the accusation that Israel is responsible for mistreating Palestinian children as a lever for demonizing Israel. They go through parliament to parliament. They spoke in Australia. They always find somebody to invite them to speak. Of course, they speak in a number of European parliaments. And you're right, there's absolutely no evidence to support what they're claiming. They make it up. And almost nobody in their audience asks the question, how do you know this? Can you demonstrate this other than saying he said, she said? And they can't. They also get all the numbers. They make up numbers. The Israeli government does produce totals of how many Palestinian minors are held by Israel at any given time and what they're being held for. And obviously, terrorism, a large part of it. You'll never see terrorism mentioned in a DCIP report.
Sure.
Now, what they did, this is important to add to this. Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota did introduce now twice in the previous Congress and the current Congress, bills that would punish Israel, would deduct a certain amount of money from American military aid to Israel on the grounds that this is money that's being used for the suffering of children. Mm-hmm. And she gives them a platform. The language of her bills is cut and paste from these reports you mentioned. So there's no credibility.
Yeah.
And she gets members of Congress to sign up. I think the good news is that when we send the members of Congress our reports, a number of them have unsigned their willingness to co-sponsor the legislation. And it's not going anywhere, but that's not the point. Because if you have an event on Capitol Hill that brings in a few hundred, gets you some newspaper articles, some media coverage, and a few hundred people, staffers and others, and maybe you serve food at the same time, then you end up, that's the propaganda machine. That's how Israel gets demonized. So that's, I think, a good example of how the process works. I'll just add one other thing. In 2013, the head of UNICEF Palestine, or sometimes they call it UNICEF OPT, put DCIP reports together and put their name on it. They said, yeah, we've checked this and this is valid, or something like that. That woman who did that has been transferred about maybe 3 years ago, at least. But the report is still circulating with a UNICEF stamp of approval on it. It's still being quoted in all this DCIP campaigning, and including in the McCollum bill. And we've pressed UNICEF many times that they should disassociate themselves from this report. That they're not willing to do. But that's how the NGO game is played.
That's crazy. The PFLP itself is again, it's for the people that don't know, is a left-wing Palestinian terror group, but their socialist origins seem to be what helps them understand how to use propaganda against Israel as well as using terror against Israel. So there are people that worked for the PFLP that easily move between the terror organization and these NGOs you're speaking of. And you could talk about it also, but it's, DCIP is not the only one. There's a bunch that have PFLP members, which you alluded to before. Could you just go through some of those? Because it's just sort of amazing to me that literally terrorists, people who are members of terrorist organizations, are respected, leaders in these NGOs that are quoted and that are funded by Europe.
Yeah, it's always, to me, it's always amazing every time we find another example. And the European, I'll tell you also, when I go through a couple, I'll tell you what the European responses are, because they're just as amazing is not the right word, just as incredible, and literally not credible. First of all, we saw 4 or 5 years ago, we began to see bits and pieces of this network, the PFLP network. And I think you're absolutely right. That's very clever. And there's no other terrorist framework that has done this in any way like this scale. Sometime in the 1990s, the PFLP realized that this was when it was after the wave of airplane hijackings, and they sought a different avenue. And they also started to become more legitimate. It was after Oslo. They're part of the PLO. So they didn't give up terrorism, and I'll give you some unfortunate examples that were quite recent. But they did this in place, like the military wing. They got the terrorist wing, and they have the NGO wing.
Yeah.
Same organization. So they set up, for instance, the United Agricultural Workers Committee, UAWC, or the Health Workers Committee. These are not quite NGOs; they're quasi-NGOs. They sound like they're helping the Palestinians develop agriculture and healthcare and other good things. These are PFLP-run organizations. They have a lot of PFLP members in them. But if you're raising money, first of all, raising money, and second of all, if you want to speak in the United Nations and the Human Rights Council or other places, and you are the United Agricultural Workers Committee, and you say, I'm doing good things for Palestinians, then you get what's called ECOSOC recognition in the UN. You can go out and do all these good things. You get admitted, you get invited to give presentations on behalf of these agricultural workers. I spoke to a foreign government official who was giving them a lot of money. And I asked them, how do you know that money that you give them to Gaza, how do you know they use it for agriculture? Well, we go there and we see the fields, and that's what they tell us. So do you know what's going on under the fields? And they said, no, we don't. They're saying we're not going. We know that what's going on there. We're not going to ask questions about all the terror tunnels. And how do you know how much of your money goes to agriculture, how much goes to the terrorism? Well, they give us reports. Then the next response from the Europeans is, well, what would you think? We got to give it to somebody. We got to help the Palestinians. What else is there? So at that point, you kind of lose any kind of rational discussion. We have to give them the money. We kind of close our eyes to their terrorism activities, and they are promoting Palestinian economic development or human rights or whatever else it is. A Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR, is another example where they go to the International Criminal Court. I was going to say perform, that's probably not the right word. They do side events and they speak in the UN Human Rights Council. And this is the Palestinian Center for Human Rights based in Gaza. Well, if you're operating in Gaza and you do human rights, how much do you really deal with human rights violations by Hamas? So you can imagine what all of their content is. These are all part of the PFLP NGO network. Another one that I'll mention quickly is, and by the way, I'm just telling everybody who's listening, you can all go to our menu of NGOs, as our host mentioned at the beginning, A to Z, and look up each one of these and get more information that you could possibly want to see about the details of how all these pieces fit together, including who their funders are. Al-Haq is the main organization going to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, the prosecutor, are very much manipulated by their NGO backers. And Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth is a major player in that, been bringing Israelis to trial investigation at the International Criminal Court for about 20 years. Al-Haq is the main Palestinian partner to that. And in fact, Shawan Jabarin, who is the head of Al-Haq, is also on the Human Rights Watch Middle East Advisory Board. How very convenient. He's also vice president of the French version of Amnesty called FIDH, the Federation of International Human Rights, which is like, as I said, a French version of Amnesty, operates in dozens of countries. And Shawan Jabarin was tried and convicted back in the 80s, I think, for involvement in the PFLP terrorist activities. He was tried and convicted and served time. And later on, he served his time. Israel, he is able to live a normal life, and he does his human rights activities. Al-Haq means the law. They do international law, which means using the International Criminal Court against Israel. They get a lot of money, a huge amount of money from European governments. And back in 2007, 2008, he asked to be able to leave Israel to go to Europe. And the court went the case, the Israeli government said, no, you're involved with terrorists. And the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that he is a human rights defender by day, this is a quote, and a terrorist by night, a Jekyll and Hyde. Now, when you present this to Europeans, they say, this is just Israeli propaganda. Now, the point I want to make also here is that last August 2019, a part of a family, Schnurb family, was hiking not too far outside of Jerusalem, and an explosive device was detonated deliberately in order to kill and maim and wound, and Rena Schnurb, 17, was killed. on the spot. This was a PFLP operation. 50 PFLP members were arrested. A number of them are standing trial. I believe that close to, I don't remember the exact number, but I believe there are 5 of them have been identified as being officers and officials of NGOs, of this PFLP network. So when the Europeans would tell us back a couple of years ago, well, PFLP, yeah, they used to be a terrorist organization back in the 70s or 80s, and they did airplane hijacking, but they're a political organization now.
Right.
They're part of the PLO. They're part of the Palestinian Authority. They're part of the peace process. So it's not terrorism. Well, they're still out there doing major terrorist attacks. And it turns out that the financial officers of a couple of these NGOs were also the leaders of this terrorist cell. They got the money and they negotiated with Europe. The Europeans say, how do you know the money goes to terrorists? I think the burden of proof is on the European governments themselves. If you're dealing with people who are human rights defenders by day, terrorists by night, how do you know your money's not going to terrorists? And they never have an answer for that.
And again, it's mind blowing that the PFLP has become by proxy so respected, and their members are respected, and people don't even realize, as you said, that even.
Although I think that's changing. I think we are getting through on these issues. They are, as I said, the 4 countries that were the funding large parts of this framework stopped the funding because they were embarrassed. We named and shamed them. So I think that is continuing, and we see signs of distress that the money is being slowly reduced.
Oh, that's great. Just to bring up one more, which is one of my personal favorites because I have the interest in it because I was one of the people that exposed a number of things about it is MIFTA, Hanan Ashrawi's organizations. Again, Hanan Ashrawi, of course, is a senior executive of the PLO. She's on TV often as as a propagandist for the Palestinians, and this is her organization, MIFTA. And I had exposed a number of years ago how it was, it was publishing a blood libel, literal blood libels against Israel. But what I want to speak to you about more specifically is that if you look at MIFTA's website, they specifically are against any sort of normalization. They're against any sort of joint peace groups, even grassroots peace groups between Israel and Palestinians. They say, no, that's normalization. We're against that. And this goes against everything that the EU says that they're for, because they want to fund these sort of groups. They're very big on the Perez Center and stuff like that. And I don't know if anyone's ever gone to the Europeans and say, do you realize you're funding a group that is absolutely dead set against what you believe is necessary in order to bring peace?
The short answer is yes, actually. Mm-hmm. After that blood libel piece that you exposed, which I just add, that was on the Arabic website of MIFTA. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, none of the officials who are funding MIFTA are able to read Arabic, and they don't think that it's necessary to know what their money is being used for because Hanan Ashrawi is such a wonderful person. And it's not quite the language that they used, but it's pretty close. And as this and other outrages, let's put it like that, were being exposed, we went to some of the funders. I went to a lot of the funders, and I'll give you 2 examples. You talked about the Europeans. Well, at the time, the U.S. government, the National Endowment for Democracy, was one of MIFTA's funders, again, because of the Hanan Ashrawi connection. Now, she's deeply beloved as a, is that probably not the right word, but anyway, she is very highly respected as a voice of reason among Palestinians. Now, how that could be for someone who has been so closely affiliated with Arafat and the PLO is beyond me. She used to appear on Nightline. She was one of Peter Jennings' colleagues. I'll put it gently. There were lots of other rumors, and I'm not going to go into that. It's not relevant. But she was certainly the darling of the media, of the Western media, including the United States. And for many organizations, that was all they needed to hear or see. So we went to the National Endowment for Democracy, and there were not easy discussions, but because they really didn't know what their money was being used for, and they did stop funding it. Another example is the German government through, I believe it was the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Mhm.
I won't go into the whole thing, but that's affiliated with Merkel's conservative Christian Democratic Union. They're supposed to be conservatives, and they were funding because these are Hanan Ashrawi is a normative, peace-loving Palestinian, so we're going to support them.
Right.
Those sources of funding have stopped. What we are able to tell now, the EU does still fund Mifta, and that's also something that needs to be addressed. And it's very hard to get the European officials to justify. This all takes place behind closed doors. There is absolutely not a shred of documentation of who decides and how they decide on this money. So in 2018, the European Union provided over $350,000 to Miftah. They must have other sources of income, and I'm not sure that we even know what their total income is because they're a Palestinian group. But the Norwegian government came in second, and then the Irish government came in third in terms of their funding from European governments. And from what we can tell now, those are the most important European sources of funding, and it's as I said, having now tried a number of years to explain to them, to show them that they should be embarrassed by this funding, the aura of Hanan Ashrawi is still stronger than what the evidence shows.
Wow. Um, do you have any? Again, is there anything upcoming that you guys are working on that sound cool? That sounds cool.
Well, we're doing more and more of exposing the terror connection because it's something that is understandable. It doesn't require a great deal of nuance. It's not like arguing that an organization that says they don't do BDS but really do BDS. That's a harder argument to make. Um, I think I'll just because we're doing this now. It being June of 2020. There are two other important aspects that I'll mention. First of all, the International Criminal Court case.
Mm-hmm.
So we're waiting for the prosecutor to finally get the green light or decide is she going to claim that she has jurisdiction and can therefore open an investigation of Israeli war crimes. There is a large NGO network behind that, and exposing the degree to which she's manipulated. Yeah, the Palestinian officials are and the all of the Arab countries that are behind that are promoting this case, but a lot of the day-to-day pushing that takes place is being done by NGOs. And we've done a series of reports on that demonstrating how NGO talking points and language is just being cut and pasted by the prosecutor. And that's going to be a major issue for um, on the issue of demonization of Israel. If the court decides, if the prosecutor decides to start investigations of Israelis, that's what will be opening up a new front that has, they've been working hard to do that for a number of years. And the role of NGOs in that is important. That leads me also to the issue of Human Rights Watch. One of the first organizations that NGO Monitor that I tackled after the Durban conference, we focused on two groups. One was the Ford Foundation, because they paid for a lot of it. And the other one was the Human Rights Watch, which was very active, including preventing Jews from participating and speaking at the NGO Forum. Ann Bayevsky describes very specifically how Reed Brody, who was the head of the Human Rights Watch delegation in Durban, was part of the silencing, wouldn't allow her as a Zionist, as a Jew, to take the podium and speak against this resolution to attack Israel. This was back in September of 2001.
Sure.
Human Rights Watch so that was exposed, and we did cause some uncomfortable moments for Human Rights Watch at the time. We've written reports that document the degree to which Human Rights Watch has abused the principles of universal human rights to indulge in what is really a personal obsession of its leader, Ken Roth, in terms of using the money, 92 million a year now, and the prestige and the access of Human Rights Watch to demonize Israel. And it may take another few months, but we're putting all these pieces together. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but in recent months, Human Rights Watch lost two key people, and they've also been exposed for having not just taken Saudi money, but lied about it since 2011. And we knew something was going on. You might remember in 2009,
Yeah.
Sarah Leah Winston, who was the head of their Middle East division, really rabid anti-Israel activist, went to Saudi Arabia. And first they said no, and we found, because it was published in the Saudi, an obscure Saudi newspaper, we actually uncovered that, and they basically stonewalled all the details. But they went there to raise money to support the Goldstone report. And then when Goldstone rescinded, they lost it. They lost it. But they said they never got any money. And then The Intercept, which is a left-wing publication media platform, a couple of months ago published this big expose about how a Saudi, very corrupt Saudi, I think, real estate tycoon, billionaire, who had been the subject of a Human Rights Watch report of criticism, gave them almost $470,000.
Huh.
This had been covered up for 9 years, because it was in 2011 that the money was transferred.
Hmm.
It was revealed because somebody inside Human Rights Watch leaked it.
Huh.
So that's just an opening, because there's probably a lot more like that out there. And we don't know why, but almost at the same time, Sarah Leah Winston, who had been there since 2004 and really was the main person, aside from Ken Roth, who went after and attacked Israel on every opportunity, and she suddenly left the organization. No explanation why. And now we found out that another person who had come to Israel with Roth and to defend to promote the whole Omer Shakir case, he had been appointed as the deputy executive director, and there were reasons to think he was going to be Roth's successor. And he suddenly left, and he'd only been with the organization maybe for a year or less. So there are things going on inside this empire that suggest that there's a lot more that will come out, and we want to make sure that all of the material, all the evidence about how Human Rights Watch destroyed the universal values of human rights by using it as a battering ram against Israel, how that just is out there. All that information is available for everybody involved in the process, including board members and others who are going to be dealing with the transition.
Just quickly, since you're bringing up Human Rights Watch, I mean, does Ken Roth like have absolute power over there, or does the board of Human Rights Watch have any say in this? Because it seems to me that would be the place to go after. Because I mean, Ken Roth is just so, single-minded, obsessed about Israel, and he's tweeting all day, and he's making $600,000-$700,000 a year, but
I don't think he's actually tweeting. It's once an hour, and I think he's got an assistant or a bot that does it, except on Israel. When it's about Israel, then you can see his personal touch comes in. The language that he uses is much more hostile. Go ahead.
Do you look at? I mean, do you talk to the board member? You make a contact.
Okay, so here's the story on that. It's right. The answer to almost every question is it's complicated.
Okay.
It was complicated once. Back in 2004, 2005, I began to speak to Bob Bernstein, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. Bob was the founder of Human Rights Watch, and he would bring in board members. A large number of the board members left when Bernstein blew the whistle in a New York Times op-ed that he published in 2009, which exposed all of this. And he really accused Ken Roth of destroying his organization. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Roth was able, they lost a lot of money. He was reconstituted the board, and he got George Soros to pay for everything that they had lost and more. Uh-huh. I see no evidence that the board exercises any kind of influence. I think these are all his personal appointees. They're all his friends. And most of them are not at all have any gravitas. Most of the people you don't know their names. They're fundraisers. And for them, they get to go to the galas and be part of this, what's considered to be the world's most prominent human rights organization. And for them, it's either see no evil, speak no evil, or they're part of it. Some of them are clearly part of Roth's obsession. I said that Shaman Jabarin, the head of Al-Haq, who back in 2008 in the 1980s rather, was convicted in Israel of being a member of the PFLP, all those things. He's on their Middle East Advisory Board. So these boards have, it seems, almost no impact or no impact. They don't exert any kind of influence on these. And that's the question: is how is this going to change? Roth is probably in his late 60s now, and the question, he's been doing this since 1993.
Yeah,
Speaking of being president for life, right? He's
yeah,
been
and
and
impunity. That's the other thing. They love accusing Israel of impunity.
he loves to use that word exactly.
Yeah, and that's what they act with so much impunity. It's yeah, they can do whatever they
Well,
want.
they are their own moral guardians. So if he's and it's interesting to hear some of the exchanges when he tries to justify this. Um, that he's asked, well, there's a lot of evidence that you're disproportionately obsessed, focused on Israel. And he says, "Oh no, we only percent." This was in an interview with an Israeli journalist, radio, so it's all recorded. We only spend 1% of our budget on Israel, and that's less than all that. That's just he made that up. It's absolutely all the evidence shows the opposite. That they're way ahead on that. The number of reports, the number of employees that are focused on Israel.
Of course.
So he's been able to get away with it for a long time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'll thank you very much for coming on. I do appreciate it. It's I hope this wasn't too much inside baseball for the listeners, but
So
this is it was a no, but this is again this is something that fascinates
there's no baseball, so this is
me. Sure.
instead.
That's right. Until baseball comes back, this is all we got. But thank you very much. I appreciate it. This is for people that don't know. I interviewed. This is the second time I've interviewed Gerald. The first time I believe was like 2013, so I could dig up that old interview as well.
Back in the good days.
That was
Okay,
live in Israel. That was a lot of fun.
that's right.
So I very much appreciate you coming, and good luck with everything, and good luck with all the stuff that you're mentioning. And we can talk again. So thanks a lot.
Good. Okay, good. Thanks for all the work that you do.
Thank you very much. Take care.